Welcome back to another episode of The End Game, Insiders on Your Side. My name is Melissa Butterworth, and I am your proud host of today's podcast. Today, we're going to be talking to hospital executives and hospital leadership about the importance of understanding lab test complexity in both the acute care setting and the ambulatory lab testing setting. Now, while this can be applied to the laboratory industry as a whole, I think it's important that the listeners understand that we are going to be focusing more specifically on the hospitals for today's podcast. Now, I am so excited that we are being joined today by Jeff Myers. I had the pleasure of meeting Jeff for the first time about 5 weeks ago, where we did a joint podcast together for the American Hospital Association. And we had a really, really good time on that podcast. And so we invited Jeff to speak with us today on this very important topic. Jeff is the Vice President of Consulting and Strategic Advisory Services for Accumen. And for those listeners who are not aware, our firm, Advanced Strategic Partners, we are a merger and acquisition firm that specializes 100% of our efforts in the laboratory diagnostic space. And over the course of the last 12 months, we've had to pivot like many other folks in the lab industry. And one of the things that we did was we entered into a strategic partnership with Accumen. So I just feel so honored to be here today with Jeff. And before I get started, I like to always give a fun fact about our guests to try to kind of loosen things up. And I learned that Jeff, when he was first married, and like most men, he was probably not listening as much as we women would like. And he was talking to his wife, Jennifer, and Jennifer was talking to him about, being a medical technologist and about her experience in the lab industry. And, I think what Jeff did was he just kind of went on with his daily business. And about a week later, Jeff was contacted by an organization and was asked to be an executive for the organization. And lo and behold, it was in the lab industry. So he had to run back to Jennifer quickly, and he had to have a conversation with her so that he could better understand the lab industry. So I just think there's no coincidences. I love that story about you, Jeff. And thank you so much for being on our podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you, Melissa, for that warm welcome, and really excited to join today's podcast, talk a little bit about the lab space, my experience. I started as a CPA, working in the accounting sector, got into the healthcare space. And as you mentioned, I got into the lab space. The chair of pathology at the University of Tennessee Medical Center, who I had a relationship with, asked me if I would be interested in interviewing for the chief financial officer position for a new lab joint venture. So the rest is history. I've now been in the lab space for over 2 decades. After that position with Dynacare, Tennessee, I went to Duke University Health System, where I was CFO for the Diagnostic Services Division, Lab and Radiology. And then from there, I got into the consulting space in 2010 with an entity named Kai Solutions, which in 2016 became part of the Accumen family. And so really enjoy my time in the consulting space. I focus the majority of my time on strategic, forward-looking direction decisions, whether that is a question around should we build a $50 million offsite core laboratory? Should we enter into the molecular and genetic testing space? Should we sell our hospital outreach asset? So those are things I love doing, forward-looking strategic planning and providing really an evidence-based view of making decisions. My view on strategic decisions is to make the right decision, you have to have the right information and you have to do the right amount of due diligence. And it really leads well into the topic of today's discussion, which is around lab test mix, something that within the healthcare paradigm, when you think about case mix index, acuity factor, it fits very well within the context of how executives view healthcare services, specifically in that DRG case mix index world. So just really glad to be here today.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that incredible introduction. I think it's pretty cool. You and I both go back to the Dynacare days. I didn't realize that you were with Dynacare until someone told me that about a week ago, and it's pretty incredible. That was a fun company, wasn't it?
Very much so. And I can see, today we don't have as many regional based joint ventures. It would not surprise me at some point in the future with all of the changes in the lab space. Who knows? There may be a resurrection of the joint venture model. We'll have to see as we continue to see, significant disruption in the healthcare space, especially in the lab market, whether it's reimbursement, whether it's cost containment and challenges within the health system where they are seeking creative ways to meet their margin targets, especially in an era of declining reimbursement, while at the same time you have rising expenses.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And you're right. I don't know that we will see. I always say that. I always say that I don't know when we're going to see another organization that's going to come in that was somewhat like the Dynacare model. Of course, we had Solstice Lab Partners, which was a conglomerate of some health systems, Acrylian health systems. But I don't think that we've really quite seen one since the Dynacare days. But anyway, so Jeff, let me ask you, why is test mix such an important factor in lab testing?
Well, that's a great question. And again, I'll give the analogy. If you think about a hospital setting and you think about an inpatient stay, that reimbursement is tied to what we would call a DRG, okay, or the case mix index. And when you have a complexity factor, whether it's an inpatient admission or whether it's a lab test or a radiology imaging scan, the complexity of that test drives many things that go into not only forward-looking strategic decisions, but also the current state. And the level of complexity dictates how much a level of service costs, how much reimbursement will be for that particular service. And it allows you to understand what's happening in your business, right? The lab space, sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle, so to speak, right? Sometimes it's called the division or the cost center in the basement. And the reality is that unless there's good delineation and an understanding of test mix variation, it's really difficult to understand month to month, quarter to quarter changes. I like to go with the adage that you cannot manage what you do not measure. And lab, and I'll give some examples in our discussion today and even have those out in a way where our audience can look at a few exhibits. But if you look at test mix and you understand that there are 2,000 CPT codes in the lab test continuum, those 2,000 CPT codes map to 29 different American Medical Association CPT departments. Once you start taking that test volume and you're able to map those into categories that allow you to have a higher level view, you can start to understand variation in cost per unit, revenue per unit, productivity at the unit and or department level. And it's that adage, you can't see the forest for the trees. When you have a test mix capability, you can begin to roll that information up into a view that allows you as an executive to understand a little bit more about what's happening in your lab.
Wow. I had no idea that there were, I knew that there was 2,000 plus CPT codes, but I had no idea that they were further characterized by 29 laboratory CPT departments. That's pretty incredible. Wow. How does the cost per unit vary by section? I mean, is it significant difference?
Well, it really is. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a story and how I came about this idea of test mix. It started from a more of a homegrown approach when I was at Duke University Health System. And the example I will give is that I had an executive, not unlike yourself, come to me with the question that was, Jeff, our volumes have stayed flat quarter to quarter, yet our cost per test is up 10%. What's happening here? We thought we were doing these strategic initiatives that were going to drive down cost per unit. Well, what I was able to find out, the devil's in the details, so to speak, right? And so we had to dig into some pretty significant data to understand. And this is where I got the idea of test mix and test complexity. This was at the beginning stage of the molecular and genetic testing explosion. And what was happening, and you can see this, Duke University Health System was very much a player in that molecular test market. And what we were able to find is, yes, in low yield reimbursement, low cost per unit areas like chemistry, hematology, immunology, those volumes were staying flat. But in the areas of molecular pathology, molecular microbiology, these test items that carry a much more significant test complexity, more labor time, higher supply cost per unit, higher reimbursement. We were doing a significant amount more from that perspective. And when you put that together on an overall basis, you were able to understand that the cost per unit mathematically was going to go up. At the same time, reimbursement and revenue had gone up. And so our executive team did not quite understand until I put this in front of them in a way, as I mentioned earlier, that you could group the testing into components like molecular testing, core lab testing, microbiology testing.
Yeah, I can see
cytology testing.
Yeah, no, I could see that could be really significant. Wow. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, and I would assume that reporting the cost per unit by section is critical, but then also reporting at the section level is important, right? I mean, I can understand that, and help me understand that a little bit more. And what does that actually translate to for hospital directors and hospital systems that are looking at that?
Yeah, great question, Melissa. And one of the things we do when we do our assessment of laboratory services, a fundamental need within the hospital laboratory is to have a reporting structure that allows for some of that type of reporting. So, for example, if you think about core lab testing, that encompasses testing such as chemistry testing, organ disease panels, immunology, hematology. The average supply cost in the core lab sector, which is what I've termed that. Okay, so just want to make sure you've got 2,000 individual CPT codes. Those get mapped to 29 departments. We further categorize those into 9 different sectors. So the core lab sector, the average supply cost per unit is $2.92. Productivity is about 13 tests per hour. Now I'm going to show you or tell you the comparison to the molecular and genetics sector. The average supply cost, again, for core lab, $2.92. The average supply cost for molecular and genetic sector, $68 per test. The productivity is just above, it's actually less than 1 test per hour. So that's why it's really important to understand your test mix, because you don't understand or you can't get line of sight to what's actually happening in the laboratory. Therefore, you can't do adequate budgeting and forecasting. You can't create a forward-looking lab strategic plan. And it's really difficult to understand, again, what's happening in your lab. But if we think about an average supply cost, as I mentioned, $2.92 for core lab. The microbiology sector, $10 per test. Histology, $13 per test. Cytogenetics, $39 per test. We're talking supply chain. Cytology, $16. So on and so on. And so what you're seeing as we talk through this is the incredible variation in just one metric, which would be supply cost per test. Think about this if we back up just for a moment. Most hospitals just throw everything into the bucket, and it then results in an overall supply cost per test, for example, of, let's say, $4.50. Well, so many things encompass that overall total. And if you just look at it as a single unit and you don't put forth a little bit of effort to create the reporting structure, which would encompass the accounting system, right? The general ledger system, the test volume, right? In terms of how that gets mapped to the appropriate profit center, cost center, as well as payroll, so that you can understand those significant factors. And we'll touch on it a little bit later in terms of how you build an RVU system. You can build your own, or you can actually work with a third party to get one from that standpoint.
No, that's pretty, I mean, that's pretty fascinating. I guess the bottom line is that you really can't manage what you can't measure, right? And so at the end of the day, I mean, that's what you're getting down to, is the importance of being able to have this sort of information as a health system so that you can make critical decisions. I'm curious about what you just touched on. So how can values such as, for example, RVUs be assigned to laboratory tests, and why is that even important?
Yeah, it's a great question, Melissa. And again, so I'll give the example at full disclosure. I built a homegrown RVU system while I was at Duke University Health System. So people in the audience, they can build their own. And certainly you can also work with a partner who already has an RVU system that is built. But in order to build an RVU system, you have to take all 2000 CPT codes and you have to assess all phases of the lab testing process, including pre-analytical. So think about specimen collection, processing. So when you think about specimen collection, is it a blood specimen? Is it urine? Is it bone marrow, right? All of those things, even at that stage, have a different complexity assigned to that, right? It makes sense. A lot harder to extract bone marrow on an oncology patient than it would be just to collect a normal blood specimen. You've also got specimen processing. If you think about when that specimen arrives in the laboratory, or it's obtained from the logistics side, sometimes there's critical work streams that take place alongside that specimen, right? Maybe it's got to be frozen right away. Maybe it's got to be handled immediately. So different complexity in that work stream. Then you start going through the actual testing phase of the testing process, and you look at turnaround time, and you look at manual versus automation. Then you look at cost, then you look at reimbursement. You use factors to determine reimbursement and cost. And then you use a metric then to kind of really determine a weighted RVU unit. It does not mean that it's the actual cost per se. You have to create what we would call a normal. And full disclosure, our normal would be a comprehensive metabolic panel. It has an RVU of 1.04. And we then use that as our basis, and then we take tests. We go through a long process of assigning an RVU, and at that point, for example, an oncology breast procedure, a multi-analyte assay and algorithmic analysis, the RVU for that is 273. I mentioned earlier, our base is 1.02 for a comprehensive metabolic panel. It makes sense, right? Those are different levels. Same thing if you look at a DRG. If you look at one of the most expensive DRGs in terms of reimbursement, the highest DRG, if we think about the hospital side, is a heart transplant. And the reimbursement for that test is roughly, or that inpatient stay is, somewhere in the 300,000 range. The DRG for that isn't 300,000, right? It's something more in I don't have it right off the top of my head. The point I'm just trying to make is that you have to have a numeric weighting system that allows you to differentiate between a comprehensive metabolic panel and a molecular test, a microbiology test, a histology, cytology, so on and so forth.
And Jeff, why is this? Is this so that you can determine where the outliers are, and you can help the listeners understand, like, big picture, why is this so important to their organization?
Well, it's really important so that you can understand the change month to month quarter to quarter, right? Especially if you're doing more high complexity testing, then your reimbursement should be higher. Your cost per unit is going to be higher. Your productivity is going to be lower. And so when you start thinking about labor needs, it's important to be able to differentiate between a high volume, low expense, low reimbursement test that is typically on an automated instrument where you generate significant economies of scale, and a microbiology, a molecular test, which has a much higher complexity and has much more manual intervention or more invasive work. Therefore, you're not generating the same economies of scale.
Sure. No, that makes complete sense. I mean, when you look at the big picture, what should be included in a lab RVU system?
Great question, right? In terms of what should be included, you want to create a numeric scale for the collection process, for the specimen processing. So collection, specimen processing, the testing phase. Okay, there's a numeric unit that gets assigned to each step of the testing phase. Turnaround time. Then you want to look at, for example, reimbursement on a per unit basis. And you want to put those together and you want to create a weighted unit that allows you to then measure the variation in test, right? So, for example, you would not just take the Medicare reimbursement on its own. And for example, that's the RVU, right? So a comprehensive metabolic panel reimbursed at roughly $10. Okay. That doesn't mean the RVU should be 10, right? There's so many other factors. The reimbursement from the government cannot and should not be the only consideration. So you've got to have your own sort of methodology to weight the difference in a blood collection and a bone marrow collection, right? Because inherently, the amount of time it takes to obtain a blood tube is different from the level of difficulty to extract bone marrow, right? And so we're trying to measure the difference in complexity.
No, that makes sense. Are these the sort of things that you at Accumen do, Jeff, when you go into hospital systems to do valuations of the landscape of their organizations?
Yeah, we do, Melissa, right? So we use the RVUs in some different ways, right? We partner with hospitals and health systems where we sell an RVU file, a licensed flat file that they have for their use, and they can do what they wish, right? There's a lot of different use cases for this. To get to your question, we use the RVU system in every analysis engagement we look at. We use it to understand key performance indicators so that we can compare hospitals to affiliated hospitals within their own health system so that we can explain to you, Melissa, the executive who has 5 hospitals under her purview, why lab cost per unit varies among the 5 different organizations, for example. We're able to use the RVU system to do benchmarking with similar type organizations that have similar test volume, similar test mix. And the thing that we use it for more than anything is to provide strategic guidance on should we create an off-site core lab, for example, because we want to understand what type of testing are we going to do. Another place we use the RVU system is how much should the cost allocation be to our hospital outreach program, where we know we're leveraging fixed investments in facilities, equipment, labor. And when you think about testing labor, especially in that hospital outreach space, it's really a step variable paradigm. Okay, it's not a one-to-one. Right. So the RVUs are very good at understanding methodology in terms of understanding cost allocation. For example, in a hospital outreach division, if they're contemplating selling their hospital outreach, they need to understand exactly how much in expense is going to go away.
Sure.
Right? Because typically a hospital outreach program, everything is embedded into the testing department. So you might have 1 million core lab tests funneling through his outreach, but the cost lives in the core lab. So you have to have a methodology to extract that cost using an evidence-based model to extract that cost so that you can create a specific hospital outreach P&L and understand the value of that outreach asset.
That's incredible. Boy, Jeff, where were you back when I started my career? I ran a hospital outreach program for the first 9 years of my career for one of Ascension Health's outreach. And I can tell you right now, this is all the stuff that we would have loved to have had, back when in the early days. It's pretty incredible. I've had the opportunity to see some of the reports you put together, and boy, they're really incredible. So your clients are very lucky to have you, and I'm very lucky to have you all as a partner. I just can't speak highly enough about the type of work that you all do. And, so thank you for going through that explanation. I think it's really critical for lab executives and for hospital leadership to understand, that all of these different variables, are critical to understanding, what it is, what does a lab landscape actually look like? And the devil is in the detail. So I think all of these are very critical points. Now, is there a relationship between the lab test mix and hospital case mix index?
Yeah, very much so, Melissa. I mean, it's very much analogous to the case mix index, and that's how we've built the RVU system. If you look at a DRG, case mix index, the higher the case mix index, the acuity factor, the higher the level of inpatient reimbursement. If you look at your test complexity and you come up with a measure to be able to understand that test mix variation, your own RVU, whatever basis you use to build that, as long as you use the fundamental approach that we've talked about today, would yield that same result. That the higher the weighted RVU or test complexity, the higher the reimbursement will be for that test or the reimbursement yield, the higher your cost per unit will be, and the lower or the greater amount of labor you are going to need to perform that test. So it's a direct one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Jeff, for the viewers that have just tuned in, I know we've covered a lot today. If you could give kind of like a high level summary of the key hot points that we discussed today about the importance of understanding the lab test complexity in both the acute care and the ambulatory care setting, what would be like, if you could just pick any 3 top highlights that we discussed today once again, for viewers just tuning in, and just kind of summarize our discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I really think, to summarize, when you think of the lab, there's 2,000 CPT codes. We have to have the ability to funnel those 2,000 units into a way that an executive can understand their business. So being able to roll those 2,000 CPT codes up into some level of financial reporting categorization that is supported by the finance department in terms of just the general ledger structure, your payroll system, as well as the accompanying lab system, you're able to get some really good information from that standpoint. And as we mentioned earlier, you cannot manage what you do not measure. And so having the ability to measure lab test mix is a critical component to being able to understand what's happening in your division.
Yeah, no, those are all really, really great points. And for our listeners out there, I just want to say we really appreciate you all tuning in today. Jeff, I've learned a tremendous amount on today's episode, and I'm certainly, I know and for certain that our viewers have as well. For those of you who are interested in listening back to this podcast, we will be making it available at www.advancedstrategicpartners.com. Or you can always go to Spotify and Apple and type in The End Game by Melissa Butterworth, and you can re-listen to this episode. Until our next episode, I'm signing off as your host. See you soon.